The war took everything and she knew at the moment the first bombs fell from the sky above her of Prime, and the explosions lit up the three suns that hung in the purple sky like angry gods demanding sacrifice and blood. She had been in the great library when the attack began, and around her the ancient texts that held 10,000 years of elven wisdom turned to ash in seconds, and the screaming started immediately, and never seemed to stop, as the alien warships descended through the atmosphere like massive black insects hungry for death. Was a scholar and not a warrior, and she had spent her entire life learning songs and histories, and the peaceful ways of her people, but none of that mattered now as the ceiling collapsed and fire spread through the corridors, and she crawled over bodies of friends who had been alive just moments before. The Dominion had come without warning and without mercy, and they had no interest in talking or negotiating or showing any kind of honor, because that was not how they operated. And in just 3 hours, they had destroyed the entire orbital defense fleet, and shattered the planetary shields, and begun the systematic murder of everyone on the surface. Stumbled through the burning streets of her city, and watched the crystalline towers that had stood for crumble into dust, and saw the gardens where she used to walk with her mother turn into fields of glass from the heat of the plasma weapons, and everywhere there were bodies and smoke, and the sound of the enemy ships overhead hunting for survivors. She did not know where she was going, but her feet carried her toward the Temple of First Light, which was the oldest building in the capital, and had survived wars and disasters for longer than anyone could remember, and something deep inside her told her to go there even though fire and death waited in every direction. The temple was mostly ruins by the time she arrived, and the great dome had collapsed inward, and the sacred pools had boiled away to nothing. But in the center of the destruction, she saw something that should not have been there, and could not have survived but somehow had. An egg sat in the middle of the rubble, and it was glowing with a soft golden light, and pulsing like a heartbeat, and knew, without being told, that this was something ancient and powerful, and meant for her alone. Her hands were burned and bleeding when she touched the egg, and the moment her fingers made contact the shell began to crack, and golden light spilled out, and something inside pushed its way free into the world. The creature that emerged was small and covered in midnight black scales, and had eyes like molten gold, and it looked at her with intelligence that seemed far older than its tiny body, and it made a soft chirping sound and climbed onto her shoulder, as if it had always belonged there. Did not know what the creature was, but some ancient memory in her blood recognized it as a dragon, even though dragons had been extinct for 10,000 years, and were supposed to be nothing more than legends and myths from the old times before her people had abandoned violence and war. The dragon was warm against her neck, and she could feel its heartbeat matching her own, and somehow she knew that they were connected now in a way that went deeper than words or thoughts, and that this small creature would grow and become something terrible and beautiful and deadly. Around them, the world continued to burn, and the soldiers moved through the streets executing anyone they found, and knew she had to leave or die, and there was no third option because the enemy did not take prisoners or show mercy to anyone. She ran through the smoke and fire with the dragon clutching her shoulder and its small claws digging into her skin, and she could hear it making sounds that were half purr and half growl, as if it was angry at the destruction and wanted to fight, but was too small to do anything yet. The emergency transport station was on the edge of the city, and most of it had been destroyed, but there was one small ship left, and its engines were still running, and climbed inside, and sealed the hatch behind her just as another wave of fighters screamed overhead. She had never piloted a ship before, but the controls were simple enough, and her people had designed everything to be user-friendly even in emergencies, and she managed to get the vessel off the ground and into the sky, even as plasma bolts from enemy weapons streaked past the hull. Looking down at her world through the viewport, she saw nothing but fire and destruction and death, and knew that everyone she had ever loved was gone, and that Prime was dying, and would never recover from this. And she was the last survivor of a civilization that had lasted for 10,000 years. The dragon on her shoulder grew larger even as they climbed toward orbit, and by the time they reached space, it was the size of a large cat, and its wings were starting to unfold and could feel its thoughts pressing against her own, and they were thoughts of rage and hunger, and the need for revenge. She brought up the navigation computer and asked it to find a safe world where she could hide from the Dominion, and the computer searched through the galactic database and gave her a list of possibilities. Most of the options were too close to territory or had weak defenses, or were allied with species that would not help her, but one name stood out, and it came with a warning label that said the world was quarantined and dangerous, and should be approached with extreme caution. The world was called Earth, and it was home to a species called humans, and according to the database, they had been isolated from the rest of the galaxy because they were too violent and unpredictable, and had responded to first contact attempts with what the Galactic Council called excessive and disproportionate force. Stared at the warning for a long moment and thought about the burning world behind her and the billions of her people who had died, because they had been peaceful and civilized and had followed all the rules, and it had gotten them nothing but death. She set course for Earth and engaged the hyperdrive, and as the ship jumped into faster-than-light travel, the dragon on her shoulder made a sound that was almost like approval, as if it understood what she had chosen and why. The journey took several days, and during that time, the dragon continued to grow at an impossible rate, and by the time they emerged in the Sol system, it was the size of a small pony, and its scales had darkened to the color of a starless night, and its eyes burned with golden fire. Earth appeared on her screens as a blue and green world covered in white clouds, and it looked peaceful and untouched and beautiful in a way that made her heart ache, because it reminded her of before the bombs fell. But the planet was also surrounded by weapons and defense stations and satellites that tracked her ship the moment she appeared, and she could see that these humans took their security very seriously and were ready to fight anyone who threatened them. Opened a communication channel and broadcast on all frequencies, and her voice was hoarse from smoke and grief when she spoke, and she said that she was a refugee, and that her world was gone and her people were dead, and she needed help and sanctuary. For a long moment there was only silence, and she wondered if the humans would ignore her or shoot her down, or simply tell her to leave. But then a voice came over the comm system, and it spoke in a harsh language that her translator had trouble understanding at first. The voice belonged to someone named Commander Lisa Grant, and she told to power down her weapons and prepare to be boarded, and then she said something that made want to cry, and it was this: nobody who had lost their people would be turned away without at least being heard. The dragon that had named Ash rumbled deep in his throat, and the sound was protective and ready, and she stroked his scales and told him that these humans might be different from the monsters who had destroyed their home. Human soldiers in powered armor approached her ship in a boarding craft, and their weapons were ready but not aimed at her, and they moved with professional caution, and could see in their body language that they were dangerous but not cruel, and there was a difference between those two things that mattered more than she could say. She opened her airlock and stood there with Ash at her side, and the dragon was now large enough to be intimidating, but he stayed calm because she was calm, and together they faced the humans who would decide whether they lived or died. Commander Lisa Grant was shorter than expected and broader in build, and her dark eyes were sharp and assessing, and she looked at the dragon without fear, and then with something that might have been sympathy. The commander welcomed them to Earth Defense Station Liberty and offered medical care and food and rest, but first she needed to know what they were running from and whether it would follow them here. Told her everything, and she showed the humans the recordings of Prime burning and the ships destroying her world and the systematic murder of 4 billion people in less than a day, and she watched the human faces as they absorbed what they were seeing. She expected horror or disbelief, but what she got instead was cold assessment and tactical analysis and questions about enemy capabilities and numbers and strategies. And it was clear that these humans were not shocked by violence, but were instead studying it like a problem to be solved. The humans asked her about the Dominion and their military strength and their expansion patterns, and answered as best she could, and told them that the enemy would track her quantum signature and would eventually come to Earth looking for her. She apologized for bringing danger to their doorstep and expected them to be angry or afraid, but Commander Lisa Grant did something did not expect, and she laughed, and it was not a cruel laugh, but the laugh of someone who had heard similar threats before and survived them. The commander said that Earth had not been conquered in 300,000 years of human history, and plenty of people had tried and failed. And then she asked to tell them everything she knew about the so they could prepare. Over the next several hours sat in a conference room that smelled strange and bitter, and she showed the humans everything she had recorded and watched as they studied the tactics and weapons and strategies that had destroyed her entire civilization in hours. The humans did not seem frightened or overwhelmed, and instead they pointed out weaknesses in the approach and discussed ways to counter their orbital bombardment tactics, and talked about something called swarms and point defense networks, and realized that these people had been thinking about how to fight wars in space for a very long time. Admiral Kate Foster was an older woman with hair and sharp eyes, and she made a decision quickly and told her people to take the information up to Earth Command and the Security Council, and in the meantime would get everything she needed, including quarters for herself and her dragon. The Admiral told that Earth had been watching the galaxy for years and knew about the Galactic Council and the Dominion, and had been deliberately isolated because the other species thought humans were too violent and unpredictable to be trusted. Then Admiral Foster smiled, and it was sharp and cold, and she said that if they wanted to come to their system looking for a fight, the humans would be happy to teach them exactly how violent and unpredictable they could be. That night stood at a viewport in her quarters and watched Earth turn slowly below, and Ash lay beside her sleeping, and he was now the size of a horse and still growing, and she pressed her hand against the glass and thought about her mother and father and brother, and everyone she had lost. Commander Lisa Grant came to visit and brought hot tea, and told that she understood what it was like to lose everyone, because she had lost her own wife and daughter to terrorists 3 years ago, and the pain never really went away, but you could choose what to do with it. Lisa said that had a look in her eyes, and it was the look of someone who wanted revenge and not just safety, and she recognized it because she had worn the same look herself and had learned to channel that anger into something productive. Asked if channeling the anger had helped, and Lisa said that some days it did, and some days it did not, but at least it gave the pain a purpose, and meant that fewer other people would have to feel the same way. After Lisa left, lay down beside Ash and pressed her face into his warm scales and listened to his heartbeat, and told him that they had survived for a reason, and that reason was to make sure Prime would be remembered and avenged. The dragon opened one golden eye and looked at her, and she could feel through their bond that he understood and agreed, and that together they would make the pay for what they had done. In her dreams that night she saw enemy warships burning and soldiers running in fear, and a haired human admiral standing on a bridge giving orders that would change everything. She woke feeling something she had not felt since before the bombs fell, and it took her a moment to recognize it as hope mixed with the cold promise of retribution. They were coming, and they expected to find an easy target and a helpless refugee. But what they would find instead was something they had never encountered before and would not survive. Earth was ready, and so was she, and together they would show the galaxy what happened when you made the mistake of attacking people who knew how to finish what others started. The humans were different from any species had ever encountered, and she noticed it immediately in the way they moved and spoke, and carried themselves with a kind of controlled energy that seemed ready to explode into action at any moment. Commander Lisa Grant stood at the airlock with armed soldiers, and their weapons were lowered but not put away, and they watched Ash with interest but not fear, even though the dragon was now large enough to be dangerous, and his scales rippled with barely contained power. Lisa looked at the dragon and said it was quite a pet, and corrected her immediately, and said Ash was not a pet but a partner and her last connection to everything she had lost, and the only family she had left in the entire universe. The commander's expression softened, and she introduced herself properly and welcomed to Earth Defense Station Liberty, and said she looked like she needed medical attention and food, and about 3 days of sleep, and they could provide all of that. But first Lisa needed to know exactly what was coming, and when it would arrive, and how bad things were going to get, because Earth needed to prepare for whatever followed through space. Straightened despite her exhaustion and the burns on her skin and the ringing in her ears that would not stop, and she told them about the Dominion and how they had destroyed her in less than 1 day. 4 billion souls had died in the attack, and the enemy had shown no mercy and taken no prisoners, and simply killed everything that moved and burned everything that stood and left nothing but ash and death. They did not negotiate or communicate or give warnings, and they simply arrived at a world and destroyed it completely, and then moved on to the next target, and they had been doing this for decades without anyone stopping them. A young human soldier asked how soon the enemy would arrive, and admitted she did not know because she had fled before the fleet had finished with the inner colonies, but they had detected her escape and would track her quantum signature eventually. She looked at the humans and apologized for bringing doom to their doorstep, and said she had nowhere else to go, and no other species would help her, and she was sorry that Earth would suffer because of her. The silence that followed was heavy, and Ash growled low in his throat, sensing the tension, and his golden eyes tracked every human in the room, ready to defend if needed. Then Commander Lisa Grant did something unexpected, and she laughed, and it was not a mean laugh or a disbelieving one, but the laugh of someone who had heard similar warnings before and lived to prove them wrong. Lisa said that Earth had not been conquered in 300,000 years, and plenty of people had tried, and humans were still here and still free, and a bunch of genocidal aliens were not going to change that. She asked to tell them everything about and their numbers and capabilities and tactics and weaknesses, and anything else that might help Earth prepare for war. Over the next 6 hours sat in a conference room that smelled of something called coffee, and she told the humans everything while holographic displays showed the final moments of Prime. The footage showed drop ships landing and soldiers pouring out, and plasma weapons turning cities to slag and orbital platforms, reducing continents to craters, and it was the death of an entire civilization captured in brutal detail. Watched the human faces as they absorbed the recordings, and she expected to see horror or grief or shock, but what she saw instead was grim assessment and careful study. A tactical officer named Captain Hayes pointed out that they relied heavily on controlling space, and once they owned the orbital high ground, they simply hammered targets from above, until nothing was left. Their ground forces looked almost weak, as if they were not expecting real resistance, because most species they attacked were peaceful and civilized, and tried to negotiate instead of fighting back. Said that was exactly right because they had conquered 47 worlds before hers, and none of those species had been prepared for total war without rules or mercy. Her people had defensive fleets, but they fought according to the galactic conventions, and gave the enemy chances to withdraw and targeted only military installations, and avoided civilian casualties, because that was the civilized thing to do. They had used that honor against them, and struck civilian targets first and killed billions before the Elven military even understood what was happening. Admiral Kate Foster leaned back in her chair, and she was an older woman with hair and eyes that had seen too much, and learned from all of it. The admiral asked if the Galactic Council knew about the Dominion and their genocides, and said yes, they knew, and had lodged formal protests and issued sanctions, but the Dominion ignored all of it. The Council would not risk open war because they controlled too much territory and had too many vassal species, and fighting them would be messy and expensive and might threaten the galactic status. Lisa said it was typical that politicians would let isolated worlds die, rather than do anything that might threaten their own comfort and power. Something in her tone made look up sharply, and the commander explained that powerful people sacrificing the weak to maintain their own position was nothing new and had been true since the first human picked up a rock and called it authority. But humans were good at disrupting the status, and it was kind of their specialty, and they had been doing it for their entire history. Admiral Foster stood and said she would take the information to Earth Command and the Security Council, and in the meantime would get medical treatment and quarters, and whatever resources she needed, including space for her growing dragon. Then the Admiral said something that made want to cry with relief, and it was this. Earth had been watching the galaxy for years and knew about the Council and the Dominion, and had been deliberately isolated because everyone thought humans were too volatile. The other species might have a point about human volatility, but if they wanted to come looking for a fight, they would get an education in exactly how volatile humans could be when properly motivated. That night in her quarters stood at the viewport watching Earth turn below, and Ash lay beside her sleeping, and he was growing so fast that soon he would be too large for any indoor space. She pressed her hand against the cool glass and thought about her mother, who had sung her to sleep with songs of peace, and her father, who taught her that violence was always the last resort, and her younger brother, who had wanted to be an artist. All of them were gone and reduced to atoms by beings who saw beauty, and decided it needed to be destroyed just because they could. The door chimed, and Lisa stood in the corridor holding 2 cups of tea, and she said she thought might still be awake, and offered the drink with a warning that Earth plants might affect her biology differently. Accepted the cup, and felt the warmth against her palms, and asked why the humans were being kind to her when she was a stranger who had brought danger to their world. Lisa settled against the wall and said that had lost everything and was still standing, and that took strength. And yes, maybe trouble was coming, but trouble was probably coming anyway. Bullies like that did not stop until someone stopped them, and it was better to know about them now and be prepared than to get caught by surprise later. Plus, Lisa said that had a certain look in her eyes, and it was the look of someone who was not just seeking shelter but seeking payback. Lisa recognized that look because she had worn it herself 3 years ago when terrorists bombed a civilian transport and killed 300 people, including her wife and daughter. She had spent a long time being angry and broken, and then realized she could either let the anger eat her alive or channel it into making sure fewer people had to feel what she felt. Asked if the channeling had helped, and Lisa said some days more than others. But yes, it helped because it turned out she was very good at protecting people when she had proper motivation. After Lisa left, drank the tea, and it was soothing and warm, and she lay down beside Ash and pressed her face into his scales and felt the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. She whispered to the dragon that they had survived for a reason, and that reason was to make sure Prime would be remembered and its death would be avenged. Ash opened one golden eye, and the intelligence there was growing sharper and more focused, and she could feel through their bond that he understood and agreed. In her dreams that night saw warships burning and soldiers fleeing, and a haired admiral standing on a bridge giving orders that would reshape the galaxy. She woke feeling anticipation and the knowledge that the war was coming, but this time it would be different because this time the victims would not die quietly. 3 weeks passed quickly, and during that time learned about human military doctrine and tactics, and was amazed at how differently they thought about war compared to her people. The elves had viewed combat as something regrettable but necessary, and had tried to minimize casualties on both sides and fight with honor and follow ancient rules. Humans viewed war as a problem to solve using the most efficient means possible regardless of whether those means were honorable or fair or followed any rules besides winning. They studied the footage of prime burning and analyzed every tactic and identified weaknesses and developed counters and ran simulations until they knew exactly how to defeat the enemy. Attended briefings where human officers discussed things like acceptable casualty rates and strategic sacrifices and collateral damage, with a cold pragmatism that would have horrified her people. But she was beginning to understand that this pragmatism was not cruelty, but rather a different kind of compassion, the willingness to make hard choices so that fewer people would suffer in the long run. Admiral Foster explained it one night over coffee, and she said that civilization had valued honor and beauty, and those were admirable things. But honor did not stop people who had no honor, and sometimes the most moral thing you could do was be willing to get your hands dirty so that fewer innocents would die. Admitted that she used to believe violence was always wrong, and there was always a peaceful solution if you looked hard enough. But now she believed violence was sometimes the only language bullies understood, and that had not destroyed her world because of failed communication, but because they could and her people would not fight dirty enough to stop them. Foster nodded and said humans had learned that lesson too many times to forget it, and every culture on Earth had stories about what happened when good people refused to fight. They had thousands of years of cautionary tales about being too civilized when dealing with savages, and that was why they prepared for war even during peace. On the 21st day after her arrival, the sensors detected something at the edge of the Sol system, and the alarms went off, and everyone rushed to battle stations. Stood on the bridge of the Defiance, which was Earth's heavy cruiser, and watched the tactical display light up with hostile contacts. 16 warships emerged from hyperspace in attack formation, and behind them were troop transports ready to deploy ground forces after the orbital bombardment. Admiral Foster stood at the command center, and her hair was pulled back, and her uniform was perfect, and around her human officers called out reports in calm, professional voices. The tactical officer said the enemy fleet was moving to attack formation, and they were not even trying to communicate or negotiate, because that was not how they operated. Said softly that this was their standard doctrine, and they had done it to 47 worlds before, and it always worked. Admiral Foster smiled, and it was not a nice smile, and she ordered the tactical officer to make sure the recorders were running, because she wanted every second documented. Then she opened a channel to the human fleet and gave an order that did not understand, and it was called Protocol Thunderstrike. Lisa explained from her position at the security station that Protocol Thunderstrike was something the humans had developed after studying footage. They had a doctrine and they relied on it, and predictable tactics were a weakness, especially when fighting someone who had time to study them. On the display, the fleet began their standard approach in a wedge formation designed to concentrate firepower while maintaining overlapping shields. Their lead ships charged weapons and prepared for the devastating first strike that would cripple any defensive fleet, just like it had crippled the Elven fleet 3 weeks ago. The tactical officer called out that enemy vessels were powering weapons and would be in firing range in 30 seconds. Admiral Foster calmly ordered all human ships to fall back and execute scatter pattern Delta 7. The human fleet suddenly broke formation and scattered in different directions, and their engines flared as they accelerated away from the incoming attack. Felt her heart sink, because it looked like the humans were retreating and running away, just like her people had tried to do, and it had not worked. But Lisa told her to watch and kept her eyes on the tactical display, even though she wanted to look away. The fleet, sensing easy victory, surged forward, and their weapons fired into empty space, where the human ships had been just seconds before. Then, as the enemy advanced deeper into the system, the trap was sprung, and everything changed. The defense platforms that had seemed dormant and inactive suddenly came alive all at once, and they fired weapons that had never seen before, and the effect was immediate and devastating. Instead of energy beams or missiles, the platforms launched what looked like small projectiles, but there were hundreds of them, and then thousands, and they filled the space around the fleet in a rapidly expanding cloud. Asked what the projectiles were, and Admiral Foster explained they were swarms, and each one was basically a tungsten rod with a guidance chip. Individually, they did not pack much punch, but when you fired 10,000 of them at speeds that approached light speed, the effect was like a sandstorm made of bullets that could punch through steel. The shields were designed to stop massive energy blasts and missile strikes, but they were not designed for this kind of attack, and the shields started to flare with each impact. The swarm did not stop and could not stop because the platforms kept firing, and the human ships that had scattered were now repositioning and adding their own volleys to the continuous barrage. The tactical officer reported that shields were dropping fast from 100% to 70 to 60 to 50, and the enemy ships were trying to maneuver, but there was nowhere to go. The first ship lost its shields completely, and before they could recharge, the tungsten rain found the hull, and at those velocities, each projectile hit like a small bomb. The ship's armor was designed to shrug off energy weapons, but it was simply punched through in thousands of places, and secondary explosions bloomed along the flanks as the relentless barrage found critical systems. Admiral Foster calmly said that was one enemy ship down, and ordered continued firing, with the next target being the command ship. Watched in stunned silence as the battle unfolded like nothing she had ever seen or imagined, and tried to maneuver and return fire, but the human ships were faster and more agile. The humans stayed at long range, using their superior acceleration to stay ahead of enemy weapons, while the automated platforms did the brutal work of grinding down the fleet piece by piece. She whispered that the humans were not even trying to board the enemy ships or engage in close combat, and Lisa asked why they would do something so foolish. Fair fights were for people who did not understand how war worked, and the humans had studied the footage and seen how they won, and decided they were not going to play that game. Instead, Earth would play by its own rules and use tactics the enemy had never encountered and could not counter. A second ship exploded when its reactor breached under sustained bombardment, and then a third followed, and the remaining ships tried to retreat, but they had pushed too deep into the system. The human fleet had them surrounded now, and was still firing and still advancing, and there was no escape possible. The tactical officer called out that they were attempting to target Earth directly, and had launched 6 heavy missiles toward the planet. Her breath caught in her throat because she had seen what those missiles could do, and had watched them reduce cities to molten craters on her. But Admiral Foster's expression did not change at all, and she simply ordered point defense to engage at will. The missiles streaked toward Earth carrying enough destructive power to sterilize continents, but they never made it past the moon. Hidden defense stations scattered throughout near-Earth space opened fire with laser arrays, and it was not elegant singular beams, but a web of intersecting fire that caught every missile. The targeting was impossibly precise, and the missiles were destroyed at ranges that should have been impossible for any tracking system knew about. She asked how they could shoot so accurately, and Foster explained it was AI-assisted targeting, because human reflexes were too slow for that kind of precision work. The computers handled the actual firing solutions, and humans just told them what to prioritize and let them do their job. Admiral Foster opened a channel to the command ship and said she wanted to see if they were interested in discussing terms now that their attack had failed. A face appeared on the screen, and it was alien, and with compound eyes that glittered with rage and fear, and the translator rendered its voice in harsh clicking syllables. The commander said that Earth dared to resist, and that the Dominion had conquered 47 worlds and humans were nothing but a backward species hiding in a single system. The commander threatened that the Dominion would return with 10 times the force and reduce Earth to ash and cinders, and there would be no mercy and no survivors. Admiral Foster interrupted and said she had heard it all before, and gave the 30 seconds to surrender their remaining vessels, or watch them turn into expanding clouds of debris. The mandibles clicked furiously, and it said the Dominion did not surrender and did not negotiate with prey, and would never bow to inferior species. Foster said time was up and ordered Tactical to focus all fire on the command ship and send a message that the galaxy would not forget. What happened next was studied by military analysts across the galaxy for years afterward, and it demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of human coordination. The human fleet moved with perfect synchronization and concentrated their fire on a single target, and the command ship could not withstand the focused fury. Its shields collapsed and its armor was breached, and then a human destroyer fired a single missile that punched through the failing defenses and detonated deep inside the core. The explosion was spectacular, like a miniature star blooming in the darkness, and the command ship was simply gone. The remaining vessels hesitated without their command structure, and some tried to flee, while others tried to surrender. The human fleet captured the ones that gave up and destroyed the ones that ran, and the total engagement time was 14 minutes from start to finish. Stood in stunned silence as the tactical display showed the aftermath, and 16 warships had entered the system, and none would leave. The troop transports had been captured intact with their soldiers. Now prisoners, and Earth remained untouched with its blue-green surface pristine, behind its web of defenses. She started to say something but could not find words, and finally managed to ask if this was how humans fought wars. Admiral Foster turned to her, and her expression was kind but firm, and she said that people had fought with honor and rules and expected their enemies to do the same. That was admirable and civilized, but humans had learned long ago that civilization was a luxury you earned by being willing to be absolutely uncivilized to those who threatened it. Humans did not fight fair because fair fights were stupid, and they fought to win, and they fought so that people like never had to watch their worlds burn again. Ash rumbled, and the sound was part approval and part anticipation, and his golden eyes fixed on the scattered debris field. Asked quietly what would happen now, and Admiral Foster smiled sharp as a blade and said now they would take the fight to the Dominion. They had conquered 47 worlds, and it was time to help those worlds get their freedom back and time for the galaxy to learn what happened when you angered humans. Lisa moved to stand beside and said the Admiral was being polite, but what she really meant was this welcome to Earth's first interstellar war, and would be right there with them, because nobody knew the Dominion better than someone who had survived their genocides. Looked down at Ash and then out at the debris field, and then back at the humans who had done in minutes what her entire civilization could not do. She said she wanted to help and wanted to fight, not just for revenge, though that was part of it, but for her people, and for all the species the Dominion had crushed. She wanted the enemy to face consequences and justice for their crimes. Admiral Foster said justice was what you gave to friends, but what you gave to enemies was something more final. She welcomed to the team and said it was time to teach some genocidal maniacs why humans rarely started conflicts but always finished them. The campaign to liberate the Dominion's conquered worlds began immediately, and it would take 9 months of brutal calculating warfare that changed how the galaxy viewed both humans and the rules of war. Rode into battle on Ash's back, and the dragon was now fully grown with scales black as void and wings that could span a small cruiser. His breath was concentrated plasma fury that could melt through any armor, and together they became the symbol of the liberation forces. An elf who had lost everything, and a dragon born from genocide allied with humans who fought with cold precision and terrifying creativity. The first world they liberated was called, and it was a mining colony that had been enslaved for 3 years. Remembered it from before as a place of red sands and purple skis, home to a gentle species who communicated through bioluminescent patterns on their shells. The garrison was substantial, with 10,000 troops and orbital defense platforms, and a planetary governor who ruled through casual brutality. The native population had been reduced by half through forced labor and periodic executions that the called compliance demonstrations. Commander Lisa Grant led the ground assault personally and flew alongside as they descended through the atmosphere. But this was not a frontal assault, and instead the humans deployed what they called decapitation strikes. Small teams of Special Forces soldiers were inserted directly into key locations, while an ash drew attention from above by attacking visible targets. She would never forget the expression on the garrison commander's face when a dragon descended on his command center. A creature that should not exist from legends the Dominion had never heard, wielded by an elven rider who carried weapons that mixed ancient power with human engineering. The liberation took 6 hours, and the who were used to cowed populations and straightforward tactics had no answer for human special forces. The humans struck from shadows and sabotaged communications before battles began, and turned the garrison's own automated defenses against them through something called cyber warfare. When it was over, stood in the central plaza as the native population emerged from their work camps. They were thin and terrified until they saw the soldiers in restraints and human flags flying over the garrison. An elder of the people approached with bioluminescent patterns flickering in confused hope and asked why strangers would risk themselves to free his people. Lisa answered matter-of-factly that someone had to do it because the people who were supposed to protect them had decided they were not worth the trouble. Humans had a long, ugly history of being on the receiving end of that kind of thinking, and had learned the hard way that if you waited for someone else to save you, then you would wait forever. They liberated 12 worlds in the first 3 months, and each battle refined their tactics and built their reputation. The Dominion tried to respond by sending larger fleets and more brutal governors and threats of total eradication. But every force they sent met the same fate because they were outmaneuvered and outthought and ultimately overwhelmed by humans who treated war not as a contest of honor, but as a problem to solve. Learned human combat philosophy during long strategy sessions with Admiral Foster and the growing coalition of liberated species. She sat in planning meetings where officers casually discussed acceptable casualties and strategic sacrifices with a cold pragmatism that would have horrified her people. But she understood now that this pragmatism saved lives by ending battles quickly and decisively, instead of dragging them out with pointless honor. Admiral Foster told her one night that her civilization had valued honor and beauty, and that was admirable, but honor did not stop people who had none. Sometimes the most moral thing you could do was be willing to get your hands dirty, so that fewer people would suffer in the long run. Admitted she used to believe violence was always wrong, and there was always a peaceful solution if you looked hard enough. But now she believed violence was sometimes the only language bullies understood, and the Dominion had not destroyed her world because of failed communication. They destroyed it because they could, and because her people would not fight dirty enough to stop them. Foster nodded and said humans had learned that lesson too many times to forget, and every culture on Earth had stories about what happened when good people refused to fight. By month 6, the Dominion was in crisis because 27 worlds had been liberated, and the freed populations were joining the fight. Former slaves took up arms, and former victims became soldiers, all coordinated by human tactical doctrine that emphasized mobility and intelligence and overwhelming force. The scholar who never wanted to be a warrior found herself becoming a legend across the galaxy. Recordings of her astride Ash diving through defenses, while human forces struck from unexpected angles, spread through underground channels. Slaves whispered about the elf and her dragon, and about the humans who fought with cold fury, and about liberation coming on wings of fire. The Dominion's response to the liberation campaign was predictable in its brutality, and they began executing hostages from worlds they still controlled. They broadcast the killings as warnings to other slaves, and increased their military presence in strategic sectors, hopping, to intimidate the rebellion into stopping. Finally, in desperation, they petitioned the Galactic Council for intervention, and claimed that Earth was violating the principle of non-interference. They said humans were disrupting the galactic order and committing acts of unprovoked aggression against legitimate sovereign territories. The Council, after months of deliberation, agreed to hold a formal hearing, and Earth was summoned to account for its actions. Admiral Foster and representatives from freed species made the journey to the Council station in the Vega sector. The Council chamber was massive, with seats for representatives from 200 member species, and the walls were decorated with symbols of peace and prosperity. It all looked very civilized and proper until Admiral Foster began presenting her evidence, and everything changed. She asked if the Council wanted to talk about unprovoked aggression, and then showed them footage of 47 worlds destroyed or enslaved while they did nothing. She played recordings of 12 formal petitions for aid that had been received and ignored, and pointed out that the Council knew what the Dominion was doing. Their only response had been to issue sanctions that had no enforcement mechanism and meant absolutely nothing. Foster played all the footage, and it was brutal and unflinching, showing prime burning and work camps and mass graves on Helios 7. The execution broadcasts were shown in full and liberated populations about years of suffering, while the Council monitored the situation and did nothing. The Admiral said the Council was right that Earth was disrupting the galactic order, but that order was rotten to its core. It protected the powerful at the expense of the weak and valued stability over justice, and allowed monsters to flourish as long as they did not threaten the core worlds. Foster looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of representatives who could not quite meet her gaze, and made an offer. If the Council wanted Earth to stop, then they should show they were willing to do their jobs and commit forces to fight the Dominion. They should protect the species they claimed to represent and be the guardians they pretended to be, instead of politicians hiding behind paperwork. The silence was deafening, and representatives shifted uncomfortably because they knew she was right, but admitting it would mean taking action. Finally, the Council speaker, who was an ethereal being from one of the founding species, responded in tones of diplomatic disapproval. The speaker said that Earth failed to understand the complexities of galactic politics, and military intervention could destabilize the entire region. Found herself standing before she realized what she was doing, and her voice cut through the chamber like a knife. Ash, who had been allowed in as her cultural companion, raised his massive head and fixed the Council with predatory golden eyes. She asked how they could talk about destabilization when the Dominion had already destabilized 47 worlds permanently. They had killed trillions, and yet the Council was worried about political complexity and maintaining comfortable positions. Said she used to be like them and believed in laws and civilization, and the idea that reason and dialogue could solve any problem. Then she watched her entire world die while the Council issued statements of concern and did nothing of substance. The humans they were condemning were the only reason any liberated world still existed, and were the only ones who treated genocide as something worth fighting. Another council member interjected that Earth had violated numerous treaties in the process, including unauthorized military action and interference in sovereign systems. Lisa said flatly from her position beside that the Dominion lost any claim to sovereignty when they started practicing genocide. The council could hide behind legal technicalities all they wanted, but history did not judge people by whether they followed the rules. History judged them by whether they did the right thing when it mattered. The debate raged for hours, and the council was divided, with some species genuinely horrified by the evidence. Others were more concerned with maintaining the status, and still others were afraid of what human involvement meant for their own security. In the end, they reached a typically bureaucratic conclusion and decided to strongly encourage both sides to pursue peaceful resolution. They would deploy monitoring teams to assess the situation and would reconvene in 6 months to evaluate next steps. Admiral Foster's response was diplomatic but pointed, and she said in 6 months the Dominion would either be defeated or they would all be dead. Either way, the Council would not need to monitor anything, because the issue would be resolved one way or another. That night back on the Defiance stood in the observation deck, with Lisa watching the stars through the viewport. Ash was too large now to fit inside the ship comfortably, so he flew alongside, visible as a dark shadow against the. Asked quietly if the Council was ever going to help, and Lisa admitted they probably would not. Big organizations almost never did the right thing when it cost them something, and that was why you needed people willing to act without permission. People willing to risk official condemnation and stand up and say, "This is wrong and I am going to stop it," even when everyone else wanted to look away. Asked if that was what Lisa thought they were doing, and the commander said they were doing what needed to be done. It did not make them heroes, because some of the tactics they used would horrify ethicists, but it did make them necessary. Lisa admitted that channeling her anger into action did not make the pain go away, and her family was still gone. But it gave the pain purpose and made it mean something instead of just being senseless suffering. Said she wanted the Dominion destroyed, not just defeated, but completely eliminated, so they could never threaten anyone again. She asked if that was wrong, and Lisa said it was not wrong to want to protect future generations from experiencing the same trauma. The Dominion had made a choice to be monsters, and was just making a choice about consequences. Admiral Foster entered the observation deck with new intelligence from scouts, and her expression was grim. The Dominion was massing its remaining fleet at their capital world of Prime, and it looked like they were preparing for a final stand. Everything they had left was being pulled back for one last, desperate battle to protect their. Foster said this was it, and one more battle would end the war, but it would be the bloodiest fight yet. The enemy would have every advantage, including home ground and fortified positions, and nothing left to lose. Had already done more than anyone could ask, and if she wanted to sit this one out, nobody would blame her. But looked out at Ash flying alongside the ship, and felt through their bond his readiness and hunger for the fight to come. She turned back to Admiral Foster with eyes that held no doubt, and said she had come this far, and would see it through to the end. Foster nodded, and said then they would finish it, and take the fight to the enemy capital, and break their fleet. They would make sure the Dominion never threatened another world again, and show the galaxy exactly how humans ended conflicts when properly motivated. The preparation for the final assault took 2 weeks, and during that time the human fleet grew as more ships arrived from Earth. Vessels from liberated worlds joined them, as well, crewed by former slaves who had learned human tactics and wanted their chance at the enemy. What had started as Earth's war had become something larger and more powerful than anyone had imagined. Spent those weeks training with Ash and practicing coordinated attacks with human fighter squadrons. The dragon was now massive enough that his wing beats could knock smaller craft off course, so they developed hand signals and flight patterns. She also worked with Admiral Foster and the tactical team planning the assault on Prime. The home system was heavily fortified with orbital platforms and defense stations, and the largest concentration of enemy warships in one place. It would be the most dangerous battle they had faced, but also the most important because winning meant ending the Dominion forever. Lisa came to visit the night before they departed and brought tea like she had that first night weeks ago. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while, watching Earth turn slowly below through the viewport. Finally, Lisa said that tomorrow would be hard and people would die, and there was no way around that. War was ugly and brutal, and even when you won, the cost was high, and you carried the scars forever. But she also said that some things were worth fighting for, and stopping genocidal empires was definitely one of those things. Agreed, and said she was not fighting just for revenge anymore, though that was still part of it. She was fighting so that no other species would have to watch their world burn, and so that the galaxy would know there were consequences for choosing to be monsters. Lisa smiled and said that was a good reason to fight, and probably the only reason that mattered in the end. The human fleet departed the next morning, and it was an impressive sight with dozens of warships and support vessels moving in perfect formation. Rode Ash alongside the Defiance, and through their bond she could feel his anticipation mixed with grim determination. This would be the last battle, and they both knew it, and they were ready to finish what had started with fire and death on Prime. The journey to the home system took 3 days through hyperspace, and during that time, the entire fleet was on high alert. Admiral Foster ran simulations and drills, constantly making sure everyone knew their role and could execute under pressure. The liberated species crews were nervous because they had never faced odds this bad, but the human commanders were calm and confident. They had studied the defenses extensively and developed a plan that would exploit every weakness while minimizing their own casualties. When they emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the system, the sight before them was daunting. Orbital platforms ringed the capital world like a crown of thorns, each bristling with weapons that had held off challenges for a century. The Dominion's remaining fleet was positioned in a defensive sphere, with 73 warships salvaged and recalled from every corner of their territory. They were dug in and desperate and dangerous, but Admiral Foster stood on the bridge of the Defiance, studying the tactical display with calm focus. The enemy was hailing them, and Foster ordered communications to put it through. The face that appeared was the supreme leader of the Dominion herself, and her compound eyes glittered with hate and desperation. She said Earth had destroyed their empire and stolen their conquests, and corrupted their vassals with barbaric ideology. But humans would not take thee, and the Dominion would fight until the last soldier fell, and there would be no surrender. Admiral Foster interrupted and said they had heard the dramatic speech before and made a simple offer. Surrender now and submit to galactic justice for war crimes, and the civilians would live. Keep fighting and Earth would dismantle the defenses and take them anyway. The Supreme Leader had 60 seconds to decide. The commander's mandibles clicked furiously, and she said the Dominion would never surrender to inferior species. They were the apex predators of the galaxy, and had conquered and consumed for generations, and would not bow to anyone. Admiral Foster said time was up, and gave the order to execute operation. What happened next would be studied by military academies across the galaxy for generations to come. The human fleet did not charge forward like the expected, but instead scattered in all directions, appearing to flee. The defense platforms tried to track multiple targets, but could not prioritize effectively. Then the first mines went off and everything changed. For 3 weeks, human stealth ships had been seeding the asteroid belt, with automated weapons platforms disguised as ordinary rocks. Now, as the human fleet retreated through the belt, those platforms came online by the thousands. Each was equipped with basic targeting systems, and they were not sophisticated, but they did not need to be. The fleet attempting to pursue suddenly found itself in a crossfire, with projectiles coming from every angle. Their tactical computers could not track that many threats at once, and shields flared and failed, and ships collided trying to evade. Admiral Foster calmly ordered Phase 2, and the liberated species ships swept in from above and below the orbital plane. They carried EMP warheads that disrupted electronics and cyber warfare packages that had been developed over 9 months of combat. It was not a battle, but a systematic dismantling of Dominion defenses by an enemy who had studied every weakness. Launched with Ash accompanied by fighter squadrons and a full battalion of the Liberated Legion, they dove toward Prime, and the orbital platforms tried to track them, but Ash was faster than their targeting systems. The dragon moved like a living creature, dodging and weaving, instead of following predictable flight paths. His breath weapon cut through defensive shields like they were paper, and landing pads melted, and defense turrets turned to slag. Then was dropping from Ash's back with shock troops and breaching into the Supreme Command Complex. The guards inside the Supreme Command Complex were professional and well-trained, but they were unprepared for close combat against species they had spent decades enslaving. The freed warriors moved with six-limbed grace, and their natural agility was enhanced by human tactical training that made them deadly. The Helios soldiers fought with the rage of people who had spent years in camps, but it was channeled into disciplined fury that made every action count. Herself moved like the scholar warrior she had become, and every motion was efficient, and every strike was purposeful. They fought room by room and corridor by corridor, and they fell back to hardened positions. But the Legion had learned from humans the art of combined arms with suppressive fire and grenades and breaching charges. When they encountered barriers too strong for conventional assault, Ash simply burned through from outside, and his massive head appeared in walls like a nightmare. It took 3 hours to reach the command chamber, and by then the battle in orbit was over. The fleet was captured or destroyed, and their orbital platforms were offline, and their ability to threaten anyone had ended. Lisa was coordinating the orbital assault forces and systematically securing every remaining Dominion facility in the system. The war for all practical purposes was won, but needed to see this through to the end. She needed to stand before the beings who had ordered her world destroyed and ensure they faced consequences. The Supreme Leader stood in her throne room, surrounded by the last of her guards. She was old and ancient even by standards, and wondered how many genocides she had ordered in her long life. The Supreme Leader hissed that Earth had doomed itself, and the galaxy would turn against them for this. She said humans were just another aggressive species that would eventually threaten all others, and the Council would stop them. Stepped forward, and the guards raised their weapons, but her Legion soldiers had them covered. She said quietly that the Council had their chance to stop the Dominion years ago, and they chose not to, so Earth did instead. The Supreme Leader said was nothing but an elf from a dead world riding a fantasy creature, allied with primitives who barely understood hyperspace. She claimed this changed nothing because another species would rise, and another empire would expand. The strong would always prey on the weak because that was the nature of the universe and always had been. Looked at the Supreme Leader for a long moment and felt Ash's presence through their bond. She felt the solidarity of the Legion around her and the weight of Prime's memory pressing down. Then she smiled, and it was sad and certain at the same time. She said the Supreme Leader was wrong because the nature of the universe was change, not domination. The strong preying on the weak was not natural law, but just bullying with philosophical pretensions attached. Bullies only won when no one stood up to them, and today they had stood up. They would keep standing up for as long as it took, until the strong learned to leave the weak alone. The supreme leader laughed, and it was a harsh clicking sound that echoed through the throne room. She said had naive idealism, and would learn that power corrupts as human philosophers said. Given time, Earth would become everything they claimed to hate, because that was how power worked. Lisa entered the throne room with human marines, and said maybe the supreme leader was right. Probably humans would make mistakes and slide toward becoming what they fought against. But the difference was that humans knew it and taught their children about the times they became monsters. They remembered their mistakes, and when they started sliding toward darkness, there were usually people willing to drag them back. People like who had seen what real evil looked like, and would not let it be normalized or accepted. Admiral Foster appeared in the doorway and said the Dominion command structure was in custody. All major military assets were secured, and they were getting reports of spontaneous uprisings on every remaining occupied world. The slaves had heard about the attack on the capital and decided to finish what Earth started. Foster approached the supreme leader calmly, like she was completing a checklist. She said the leader was charged with genocide and crimes against sapient species and systematic violations of galactic conventions. There would be a trial before a tribunal consisting of representatives from every world the Dominion had enslaved. Foster expected they would have many questions for their former oppressor. The supreme leader was led away still hissing defiance, and her guards surrendered without fighting. The will to resist had been broken along with their fleet and their empire. In the days that followed, the galaxy was forced to reckon with what had happened. Earth had conducted an unauthorized military campaign and violated numerous treaties about interference. They had systematically dismantled an empire that had stood for a century. The Galactic Council was furious and alarmed and secretly terrified of this new player, who did not respect their rules. But they could not ignore the results, because 47 worlds were free. Trillions of beings who had lived under occupation were now liberated. The dominion that the Council had been too afraid to confront was finished, and would never threaten anyone again. Stood on a platform on Prime's largest moon, watching as restoration ships descended toward her. The planet was still and wounded, but human terraforming experts said it could be saved. In a century or maybe less it could be green again, and the land could heal even if the cities never returned. Lisa joined her at the observation rail and said they were heading back to Earth soon for a diplomatic mission. The Council wanted to discuss Earth's actions, and Admiral Foster was planning to tell them exactly where they could put their concerns. Asked if the Council would try to punish Earth, and Lisa said they would try. They would threaten sanctions and trade embargoes and diplomatic isolation. But Earth would remind them that they let genocides happen while they debated procedures. Humans were not asking permission anymore, and if someone needed help the Council would not provide, then Earth would. That was the new policy, regardless of what anyone thought about it. Said that was a dangerous policy because it made Earth responsible and meant every crisis became their problem. Lisa shrugged and said it did suck, but someone had to do it. Humans were wired to see suffering and be unable to look away, and it got them into trouble constantly. But that was who they were, and they were not going to change. Looked down at Ash sprawled across a landing pad, being studied by fascinated human scientists. The dragon suffered their attention with patient dignity and occasionally snorted smoke when instruments got too intrusive. She asked what Earth would do with her and Ash, and Lisa said that was choice to make. If she wanted asylum on Earth, she had it, and if she wanted to return here and help rebuild, they would support that. If she wanted to join the diplomatic corps and keep fighting, there was a position waiting. She had earned the right to choose her own path, and Ash had too. In the end, chose to do all three, and became an ambassador representing both the ruins of and the human ideals that saved her. She traveled with Admiral Foster to Galactic Council sessions and stood before representatives who had looked away. She about what happened when good people refused to act. When the Council inevitably failed to prevent another atrocity, because councils always did, she and Ash were there. They led human liberation forces and showed the galaxy what it meant to finish what others were too afraid to start. Years later, a young historian asked about the war and those 9 months that changed everything. She thought carefully about her answer before speaking. She said humans did not want that war and would have preferred peace and diplomacy. They would have preferred that the Dominion never existed at all. But when peace was not possible and diplomacy had failed, they did what needed to be done. They fought not with honor or glory or grand ideals, but with cold calculation and overwhelming force applied at critical moments. They fought the way you fight when losing is not an option and winning is the only acceptable outcome. The historian asked about the cost because humans lost thousands in that campaign. Dragon nearly died twice, and liberated worlds suffered as the Dominion fell. Was it worth all that pain and sacrifice? Looked out at the rebuilt cities of Prime and the children playing in streets that had once been craters. She looked at the memorials to those who could not be saved. She said every life lost in that war was a tragedy, and there was no denying that. But if they had done nothing and waited for someone else to act or for the Council to find its courage, the Dominion would still be murdering worlds, and the cost would not be thousands of soldiers who chose to fight. It would be trillions of civilians who never got a choice. The historian asked if she was saying the ends justified the means. Said she was saying that sometimes there were no good choices, only necessary ones. Humans understood that and did not pretend their actions were noble or pure or anything other than what they were. Violence in service of preventing greater violence. They did not shy away from it either and saw what needed to be done and did it. The historian nodded slowly and mentioned the title of her lectures. Humans rarely begin conflicts, but she demonstrated how they conclude them. Who was the she being referenced? Smiled and said it was Admiral Foster and Commander Lisa Grant. It was the unnamed human soldier who died taking a Dominion position so her squad could advance. It was every woman who looked at genocide and said not on my watch. But it was also herself because she had learned from them. She learned that refusing to fight does not make you peaceful, but just makes you complicit when fighting happens anyway. Had been a scholar who wanted nothing to do with war. The Dominion taught her that war does not care what you want. Humans taught her that when war comes you can either win or wish you had. Outside Ash roared, and the sound echoed across the restored world. The dragon was old now with scales at the edges, but still fierce and vigilant. Still ready should the need arise to burn away darkness. That was what they had all learned during those terrible months. Evil does not stop itself, and civilization requires constant defense. Peace is maintained not by people who talk about it, but by people willing to fight for it when talking fails. Humans rarely began conflicts, but they had perfected the art of finishing them. The galaxy, for all its ancient wisdom and political complexity, had learned to be grateful for that. Other species still debated the morality of Earth's actions and argued about whether the ends justified the means. But the freed worlds did not debate anything because they knew what mattered. They had been slaves and now they were free. They had been victims and now they had justice. The Dominion was gone and would never return. That was enough. Continued her work as ambassador and mediator, helping rebuild what had been destroyed. She worked with human engineers and architects to restore damaged worlds. She trained new defenders, teaching them both elven wisdom and human pragmatism. She made sure that the memory of what happened would never be forgotten. Every year on the anniversary of Prime's fall, she stood with other survivors and remembered. They spoke the names of the dead and honored their sacrifice. They told stories about the world that was lost so future generations would know what they fought to preserve. And they renewed their commitment to ensure it never happened again. The Galactic Council eventually accepted Earth as a full member, though the relationship remained complicated. Humans had too much power and too little patience for bureaucracy. They kept pushing for reforms and demanding action and refusing to accept the status. Other species found them exhausting and dangerous, and absolutely necessary. Because when the next crisis came, and it always did, Earth was there. They did not wait for permission or debate or careful consideration of political implications. They saw people in danger and moved to help. Sometimes they made mistakes and caused problems. But they also saved countless lives and stopped threats before they grew too large. Watched humanity grow into its role as galactic protector with mixed feelings. She was grateful for what they had done and proud to work alongside them. But she also worried about what Lisa had said about power corrupting. She watched for signs that Earth was becoming what it fought against. So far those signs had not appeared, or at least not in ways that mattered. Humans remained self-critical and willing to admit mistakes. They held themselves accountable in ways the old powers never had. Maybe that would change eventually, but for now it was enough. On her final visit to the restored Prime, before she died, stood in the garden that had been planted where her family home once stood. The flowers were different from the ones she remembered, because the original species had been lost. But they were beautiful in their own way, and the garden was peaceful. Ash lay beside her, old and tired but content. They had lived long lives and done important work. They had helped rebuild a galaxy that had been broken. She thought about her mother and father and brother, and all the others who did not survive. She hoped they would be proud of what she had become. Not the warrior part, because that had been necessity, not choice. But the builder and teacher and guardian. Someone who took the pain of loss and turned it into protection for others. That night she dreamed of fire and dragons and humans fighting impossible odds. She dreamed of Admiral Foster giving orders and Lisa bringing tea. She dreamed of the Dominion falling and worlds being freed. When she woke for the last time, Ash was there, and through their bond she felt his love and loyalty. Together they had proven that even the darkest tragedy could lead to hope. That even the most devastating loss could result in positive change. That standing up against evil mattered, even when the cost was high. The galaxy would remember them not as victims, but as victors. Not as those who suffered, but as those who ensured others would not have to suffer the same way. Humans rarely began conflicts, but when they finished them, the galaxy was better for it. That was the lesson spent her life teaching. That was the legacy she left behind. And that was why her story and the story of Earth's intervention would be told for generations. Because sometimes the only way to preserve peace is to be willing to fight for it. And sometimes the only way to stop monsters is to be more determined and more capable and more willing to do what is necessary. That was what she learned from humans. That was what she passed on to others. And that was why, despite all the pain and loss, she considered herself fortunate to have met them. Because they showed her that hope was not naive. That standing up mattered. That the strong could be stopped by those brave enough to try. The galaxy was better because humans had decided to care. It was safer because they had decided to act. It was more just because they had refused to accept injustice. Died knowing that her world had not died in vain. Its destruction had sparked something important. A change in how the galaxy thought about intervention and responsibility. A new understanding that standing by while evil happened was itself a form of evil. Humans had taught that lesson through action, not words. They had shown that sometimes the right thing to do was also the hard thing. That sometimes protecting the innocent required being willing to hurt the guilty. That sometimes peace required war. Her last thought was gratitude. For the humans who saved her. For the dragon who chose her. For the chance to turn tragedy into triumph. For the opportunity to make a difference. Then she was gone, and Ash followed soon after. But their story lived on in the rebuilt worlds, and the freed people, and the changed galaxy. A reminder that even the smallest survivors could reshape the universe. If they had the courage to try. And the right allies to help them succeed.